Hey American literature friends, this is a video about the John Cheever story, The Swimmer. This story is from 1964. It is often considered one of the masterpieces, one of the hallmark pieces of literature from the early part of postmodernism, the early postmodern era. There's several different reasons for that. It belongs to this sort of post-war kind of storytelling, but perhaps the main reason for it is, and this gets to John Cheever the person, this story is often read as one of the great stories of the rise of the suburbs. Before World War II, the suburbs as we know them had not existed. There had been the city or the town and then the countryside. And there was not a space in between. You lived in the city, or you lived at least in town, in a small town, or you lived out in the country on a farm very often. And up until World War II, the majority of people in the United States lived in a rural area, on a farm or in some kind of what we would call country area. It is not really until the 1950s that shifts, and more people, the percentage shifts, and the majority of Americans live in the city, which is true and has been getting more and more true ever since, really. But it is because of the prosperity of post-World War II, the United States, and the baby boom too, especially, and the widespread, there's a bunch of reasons that contribute to the spread of the suburbs, the rise of the suburbs, including President Eisenhower building the interstate system, and a bunch of other social and cultural factors. The first suburbs, though, appeared outside of New York City, as you can probably understand. It's our biggest, our most famous city in this country, and so the first suburbs appear there. John Cheever was from New York City originally, and he invented for his stories, many of his stories, including The Swimmer, and it's also the title of one of his novels here, a suburb outside of New York City called Bullitt Park. Called Bullitt Park because, like the bullet train, you could take a train and be there in 30 or 40 minutes if you lived in this suburb, this imaginary suburb. Cheever is not a giant of American literature like a William Faulkner or an Ernest Hemingway or somebody like that, but he is important in part because he is read as the writer of the rise of the suburbs. He is the writer who tells the stories of the suburbs when they first appear on the American landscape. The Swimmer is by far his most famous story. He has a couple of other famous stories like The Enormous Radio. He has a couple of famous novels like Bullitt Park, like I said, which is the name of the suburb that he created, this sort of wealthy suburb that he created. And the other famous novel of his is it's called The Wapshot Chronicles. He was born in 1912, so he's clearly born a little bit after the modernists. And then he dies in 1982, and so he lives into the 1980s. He lives through what we would now consider the first couple of waves of modernism. He is mainly a writer of that first wave of postmodernism, that wave that is the 1945 to 1965. That's when he does most of the writing that he is famous for. And this story fits into that. It is from 1964, and it tells the story of this upper class white guy and his family, he and his wife, whose name is Lucinda, and one of the signals that you are wealthy, that you're a wealthy suburbanite, is that you have a swimming pool. You're wealthy enough to have your own pool. You don't need the community pool. You don't need the public pool, even though he does swim through a public pool at one point in this story. You are wealthy enough. You don't even have a community pool. You have a pool in your own backyard. And what he does in this story is, this story starts on a Sunday morning. He is over at a family friend's house. Everybody is hungover. Everybody partied a little too much on Saturday night. It's Sunday morning when the story starts, and he decides to sort of get over his hangover and also to go home and spend Sunday with his family. He is going to swim home. And the way he's going to do that is to swim through all of his, he figures out in the first couple of paragraphs of the story this sort of map of his neighbor's swimming pools that he can swim through to get home. So he spends the entire story going through their backyard, swimming in their pools, swimming home. One of the turning points in the story is when he has to cross this big divided 4-lane highway. For us, something almost like Cobb Parkway or Highway 411 or something like that. And that is the thing that interrupts his swimming home, because that's not just a neighborhood street or his neighbor's backyard or something like that. And so part of what is happening in a physical sense in this story is him swimming through this series of his neighbor's pools. I've made a list of them. If you count them, there's like 15 pools. At the beginning of the story, he runs through like 5 of them real quick, and at the end of the story, he runs through the last 2 real quick too. So some of them don't really matter. There's a few that are big though, like his mistress's pool at the end, and his best friend's pool when he asks him for a drink, and they say that he hasn't had a drink. So what we're going to do is dive into this story and talk through the story and the different pools and what they mean and the signs. There's a trick in this story, which is that time is passing in a way different than what he perceives it. He perceives this as one long day, but because of his alcoholism, his alcohol abuse, much more time is passing. Maybe years are even passing. And part of what's happening in this story is this sort of alcoholic haze that he is in washes out his sense of reality. So there's a couple of terms we're going to talk about when we get to the end of this story that are relevant to that. Surrealism and dystopia. But first, let's dig into the basic plot of the story. Like I said, the story starts off at his this family friend's house. The family friend is the Westerhazes. Let me actually also get the story pulled up here for you guys so I can scroll through and pull some stuff up for you if we need to as we go. Here we go. Yeah. So you see right here, he says, "I drank too much. We all drank too much," said Lucinda Merrill, that's his wife. And you see right here from the beginning, everybody's kind of hungover. They're at the Westerhazes' house. The Westerhazes have a pool, and this is what gives him this inspiration to swim home, to swim through all of his neighbors' pools and swim home. His own house stood in Bullitt Park, 8 miles to the south, where his 4 beautiful daughters would have had their lunch and might be playing tennis. Then it occurred to him that by taking a dog leg, by taking a little hook to the southwest, he could reach his home by water. And so this is where he comes up with the plan to swim home. At the beginning of the story is where he skips through a few pools. He took off a sweater that was hung over his shoulders and dove in. He had an inexplicable contempt for men who did not hurl themselves into the pool. And this is one of the things that becomes important as this story goes on. He struggles to, by the end of the story, he's struggling to swim the length of the pool. He has to use ladders to get out of the pool. So as the story goes on, he gets weaker and weaker. But at the beginning, he throws himself he just dives right into the pool, swims as fast as he can to the end of it. And here's where you get the first list of the pools. First, there were the Grahams, the Hammers, the Lears, the Howlands, and the Crosscubs. He would cross Ditmar Street to the Bunkers and come after a short portage to the Levies, the Welchers, and the public pool in Lancaster. Then there were the Hallorans, the Saxes, the Biswangers, Shirley Adams, the Gilmartins, and the Clydes. He's already knows in his mind every neighbor, every friend that he's going to swim through their pool to get home. He went through a hedge that separated the Westerhazes' land from the Grahams. He swims through the Grahams' pool. He sees a bunch of people he knows. Everybody's friendly. The bartender gives him a drink. Everything is perfect. Like his world is perfect. His life is perfect. Everybody's nice to him. Everybody loves him. He's just out on Sunday having a great time. He crossed a vacant lot to the Hammers. Mrs. Hammer, looking up from her roses, saw him swim by. After leaving the Howlands, he crossed Ditmar Street, started for the Bunkers. The Bunkers pool was on a rise, and he climbed some stairs to a terrace where 25 or 30 men and women were drinking. This is where he goes to the party, and everybody's just so nice to him. A smiling bartender he had seen at 100 parties gave him a gin and tonic. Things are just wonderful. Like I said, his life is just going wonderfully. The one thing, though, is everything is going to go wrong for him in this story. And the first sign of that, the first signal that things aren't perfect, that things aren't going to go right, is in this section. And let's see if we can find it. Here we go. Scroll up here. Here it is. In the distance he heard thunder. Several times in this story, there are signs of weather. These are signs that time is passing in a different way than he thinks, but also signs that he, in his life, is going through a storm. And so it feels like summer at the beginning of this story, but by the time you get to this story, it is fall. And fall means literal in this story too. Like he, and because of him, his family have gone through this fall. They have fallen in social status, they have fallen in wealth. And there are signs of fall, like leaves falling off of trees and things like that. The other big weather signal in this story is storm. Like he goes through a storm. And this is the beginning of all those signs. In the distance he heard thunder. There's a storm coming for him. And so even though everything's going perfect right here at the beginning, there's a storm coming for him. The next big sign of that is the next paragraph. It would storm. The stand of cumulus cloud had risen and darkened, and while he sat there, he heard the percussiveness of thunder again. This is where he gets to his neighbor's house, and their name is the Levies. He gets to their house. He's surprised to find out they're not home. This is another sign that time is not moving the way he thinks it is. But he decides to wait in their gazebo, their little open-air patio, for the storm to pass. And so there's this intense, it's like an intense summer storm, like a big thunderstorm. But then it passes by relatively quickly. There's lightning. He stayed in the Levy's gazebo until the storm had passed. The rain had cooled the air, and he shivered. The force of the wind had stripped a maple of its red and yellow leaves. Well, hardwood trees aren't going to have red and yellow leaves in the middle of summer. That's the first sign of fall. And so, again, you get this weather sign that time is not moving the way he thinks it is, and that he is headed for fall. Red and yellow leaves obviously belong to fall. Since it was midsummer, the tree must be blighted, and yet he felt a peculiar sadness at this sign of autumn, fall. There we go. He braced his shoulders, emptied his glass, and started for the Welcher's pool. So he just, brushes it off, on to the next pool. He goes to the Welchers, who is his next friends, the next pool. He is surprised to find out. Let's see if we can find where that is. He seemed to remember having heard something about the Lindleys and their horses. He went barefoot through the wet grass to the Welchers, where he found their pool was dry. And so these friends of his have drained their pool. Another sign that time is not moving the way he expected. And then he comes out to the front of their house, and there's a for sale sign nailed to a tree. And he's like, I didn't know my friends were selling their house. So again, he is getting more and more lost, more and more disoriented. Another sign that time is not passing the way he thinks it is, that his life is not going the way he thinks it is, because he gets to his friend's house, their pool is drained, a sign that it's not summer anymore, and their house is for sale, and he has no clue what's going on. And this is where there's a little break in this story. Was his memory failing, or had he so disciplined it with the repression of unpleasant facts that he had damaged his sense of truth? Then in the distance he heard the sound of a tennis game. This is one of those signals. Was his memory failing? Yes, it is. His alcoholism, his problems are causing him to repress these things, to just gloss over things. And then this is where you get to where he has to cross the highway, the big interruption. The way this is often metaphorically read in the story is, this is the point of no return. This is the point where he could have turned back, where he could have saved himself and saved his family. He could have gone back, if you follow the logic of the story, he could have gone back to the Westerhazes, could have gone back to his wife and fixed everything. But once he crosses over this highway, this is the point of no return. And the story even, hits you over the head with that, gives you pretty straightforward. He could have gone back to the Westerhazes, where Lucinda would still be sitting in the sun. He had signed nothing, vowed nothing, pledged nothing, not even to himself. Why, believing as he did, Was he unable to turn back? Why was he determined to complete his journey even if it meant putting his life in danger? This is the metaphorical. He could have saved himself, but he just kept going. He kept going with the drinking, with the alcoholism. He wouldn't turn back. At what point had this prank, this joke, this piece of horseplay become serious? Well, this is the point. And once he crosses this highway, it's like the world begins to turn into his nightmare. Everything begins to go wrong. Like I said, this is the point of no return. He finally gets across the highway. The first thing that happens after he gets across to the highway is he goes to the public pool. And for him, a person who lives in this, upper class suburb where everybody has their private pool, having to go swim at the public pool, the public rec center, is a step down. So it's the first hint that this story tells you he has had not only a fall in his wealth, but a fall in his social standing. He swims through the public pool. It is, if you've ever been in a public pool, it's full of chlorine to keep them safe. They're super chlorine. It burns his eyes. And when he gets to the end of the public pool, both of the lifeguards are yelling at him and harassing him. It's this huge fall in like his social status. He's having to swim in this public pool with the lifeguards yelling at him. But he gets through the public pool. The lifeguards are yelling, "Hey, you without the identification disc, get out of the water." So it's a little bit of humiliation for him, but he just brushes it off and keeps going. The next house he gets to is the Hallorans, this elderly couple that he is friends with, sort of a generation ahead of him. And you get their beech hedge was yellow, and he guessed this had been blighted like the Levy's maple. Another sign of fall right here, another sign of his fall, just like the red and yellow leaves at the house after the storm. Fall is coming, his fall is coming. He talks to the Hallorans, and the Hallorans are the first people who straight up say something. They mention to him something is wrong. Mrs. Halloran says, "We've been terribly sorry to hear about your misfortunes, Nettie." "My misfortunes?" Ned asked. "I don't know what you mean." "Why, we'd heard you sold your house and that you're poor children." "I don't recall having sold the house," Ned said, "and the girls are at home." And so he just brushes it off, and Mrs. Halloran is like, "Fine, I'm not going to try to talk to you about it, whatever." And he swims past him. Mr. and Mrs. Halloran are the father and mother-in-law of his best friend, Eric. And so their house is right behind Mr. and Mrs. Halloran's. So he swims through their pool, goes through their yard to his friend's house, and he can't. And this is another sign of his alcoholism. He can't wait to get to his friend's house to get a drink because he needed a drink. Whiskey would warm him up, pick him up, carrying through the last of his journey. So he can't wait to get to his best friend Eric's house and have a drink. He needed a stimulant, as it says right here. He crossed the lawn in front of the Hallorans and went down a little path to where they had built a house for their only daughter Helen and her husband Eric Sachs. And Helen comes to the door, and Nettie immediately is like, "Hey, I saw your parents. I'm terribly sorry to break in on you like this. I wonder if you'd give me a drink." "I'd love to," Helen said, "but there hasn't been anything in this house to drink since Eric's operation. That was 3 years ago." And again, was he losing his memory? Had his gift for concealing painful facts let him forget he had sold his house, his children were in trouble, his wife, that his friend had been ill? His eyes slid from Eric's face to his abdomen where he saw 3 pale suture scars, 2 of them at least a foot long. So Eric's had to have some kind of serious operation, maybe a liver transplant or something like that. Something really serious. And the main character, Nettie, he has no memory of this, has no clue that his friend doesn't drink anymore. It's the surest sign, really, in the whole story that things are going wrong, and things are going wrong not just in the world, but with Nettie. It's Nettie's problem. It's Nettie's memory. It's Nettie's sickness that is driving him through this in this awful way. But Helen says, "I'm sure you can get a drink at the Biswangers," Helen says. "They're having an enormous do. You can hear it from here." So the next door neighbors across the street are having a big party, and Helen's like, "I'm sure you can get a drink over there, no big deal." What's important about the Biswangers is Nettie has always considered them socially below them. He doesn't send them Christmas cards. When they invite him to parties, he and his family don't go because they think they're above the Biswangers. In this social stratus, they are like sort of bougie new money, and he is too high class for them. He and his family are too high class for them. they would be honored to give him a drink. They would be happy to give him a drink because, you know, they'd be happy to have him at their party. And when he gets to the party, you get this sign. And if you remember, the bartender at the first party, the bartender's super nice to him. The bartender's like, yeah, here's a drink, and everybody's happy to see him. You get a reversal of that where everybody at this party is like, what, you know, what's this idiot doing here? He wasn't even invited. The bartender is rude to him. So it's this sort of complete reversal of that experience with the first party. Everything that was good at that first party is bad here. The wife, Mrs. Biswanger, says why this party has everything, including a gate crasher. And he just sort of brushes it off and says, do I rate a drink? Suit yourself, she said. You don't seem to pay much attention to invitations. He gets a drink from the bartender, but the bartender served him, but he served him rudely. His was a world in which the caterer's men kept the social score. And to be rebuffed by a part-time barkeep meant that he had suffered some loss of social esteem. And so again, the way that Miss Biswanger and the way the bartender treat him work together to show that the fall is real now. He's lost money, and in fact, he overhears Miss Biswanger say, they went for broke overnight, nothing but income. He showed up drunk one Sunday and asked us to loan him $5,000. So she's talking about how Nettie has shown up and begged for money because his family needed help, and they've had to blow him off. So like, he has slipped, but again, Nettie is in this sort of alcoholic haze and doesn't remember any of this and just brushes it off. The next pool on his list, the last but two, and this is where the story really gets sad, honestly. The last but two belonged to his old mistress, Shirley Adams. If he had suffered any injuries at the Biswangers, they would be cured there, because there is this sense that you find out that she had been in love with him. They had had an affair last week, last month, last year. He couldn't remember. It was he who had broken it off. His was the upper hand, and he stepped through the gate of the wall that surrounded her pool with nothing, so considered as self-confidence. And so he broke up with her. She was still in love with him, so he's sure that when he shows up, she's going to be like, yeah, I'll be happy to get you a drink, and happy to see you. She was there, her hair the color of brass. What do you want? And then things don't go at all how he expects. What do you want? She asked. I'm swimming across the county. Good Christ, will you ever grow up? She says. What's the matter? If you've come here for money, I won't give you another cent, she says. And so again, he's tried to borrow money from multiple people, you find out. And so she won't give him any money. All right, you could give me a drink. I could, but I won't. I'm not alone. Well, I'm on my way. And so she brushes him off in every way possible. She's not interested in him. She's not attracted to him anymore. She won't help him with his finances. And she's moved on to somebody else. And he's like, all right, I'm out of here. You also get another sort of weather, or in this case, meteorological sign, where he talks about but why should he seem to see Andromeda, Cepheus, and Cassiopeia? Those, if you don't know what that's a reference to, it's the constellations in the sky. What had become of the constellations of midsummer? He began to cry. Probably the first time in his adult life he had ever cried. Certainly the first time in his life that he'd ever felt so miserable, cold, tired, and bewildered. This is the sadness. This is where it begins to hit him, that his life has gone off the rails. His life, which had been such a dream, has gone wrong. He could not understand the rudeness of the caterer's barkeep or the rudeness of the mistress. He had swum too long. He had been immersed too long. And that immersed right there, that is he had been in the alcohol too long. He had become an alcoholic. He had been swimming in the alcohol too long, is what you're getting right there. He goes through the last few neighbors, the last couple of neighbors' house. The only thing that's really significant about these last two neighbors is he doesn't even have the strength to swim the last pool. He has to like reach over to the side to finish swimming the pool. He's just struggling to pull himself out of the pool. And so this person who just, dove into every pool and never used a ladder to help himself out of the pool, here at the end, he can't even swim the whole length of the pool. He's just weakened. He's in this sick, weakened condition. Stooped, holding on to the gatepost for support, he turned up the driveway of his own house. The place was dark. Was it so late they had all gone to bed? Had Lucinda stayed at the Westerhazys for supper? Had the girls joined her there or gone someplace else? Hadn't they agreed, as they usually did on Sunday, to regret all their invitations? He tried the garage doors. to see what cars were in, but the doors were locked, and rust came off on the handles on his hand. Going toward the house, he saw that the force of the thunderstorm had knocked one of the rain gutters loose. The house was locked, and he thought that the stupid cook or the stupid maid must have locked the place up. He shouted, pounded on the door, tried to force it with his shoulder, and then, looking in at the windows, saw that the place was empty. And so he finally makes it home, and home is empty, and he has been evicted. His home is dark and locked up and rusty and run down and empty. He has been evicted from his own life, and he is totally lost and totally alone. Everything, he has lost everything. And so what you get at the end of the story is the dream, the dream life that he was living at the beginning of the story, where he was wealthy, he had his wife and his family, you know, all the neighbors loved him, he had a good relationship with them. By the time you get to the end of the story, it's all gone. And one way to understand this story, and maybe the easiest way to understand this story, if we can get back to it here, is through one of the important pieces of course terminology. This story, and especially the end of it, drives this home, really hammers this home. This story is a dystopia. Utopia is a concept that goes all the way back to the Renaissance, to the 1500s. It is based on the idea a utopia is a perfect place. It's like a dream. It's like the beginning of this story, where everything goes right, nothing can go right. If things even start to go wrong, the world fixes itself. A utopia is paradise. It's perfection. Everything is perfect and nothing can go wrong. And even if you think it's going to go wrong, it somehow works itself out. It's like a beautiful, perfect dream. Dystopia is the opposite of utopia. It's living in a nightmare. And even if you try to fix things or make things better or repair things, it won't work. If you get to a highway and try to turn back, no, something will make you keep going. Utopia describes an imaginary ideal world. Dystopia literally translates as bad place, and it is the term applied to unpleasant imaginary places, like what you get, especially after the highway. Especially after he crosses the highway in this story is just spiraling into a dystopia. And especially by the end of the story, you are in this dystopia. Often those in which present tendencies are carried out to their intensely unpleasant culminations. Often what makes dystopias is the story thinks of some social or political or cultural trend and thinks, what if this keeps going the way it's going? What is the worst thing that could happen? And the story takes you to that worst thing that could happen. In this case, the dystopia is Nettie's alcoholism blurs his memory, it costs him his family, it costs him his home, it costs him everything. And so the dystopia, the tendency that this story is following is his sort of destructive alcoholic behavior, which finally spirals out at the end, and he's lost everything because of it. This story is also an example of surrealism because of the way that it plays with time. Surreal stories are stories where most of the story works in a realistic way. And you see that in this story. He's just going through his neighborhood, he's swimming through these pools, there's all these realistic details. There is one aspect of reality that is twisted or tweaked or warped, and that is the flow of time. And that is how surrealism works. It's mostly real, but there is some twist, some tweak that skews your perspective, that disorients you and makes it hard to understand the rules of the world. In this case, it's the movement of time, especially when he gets to Eric Sax's, and Helen is like, it's been 3 years, and Nettie is like, what are you talking about? And it becomes really clear that his sense of time, which you were following through the story, is wrong and messed up and off kilter. So this story is an example of surrealism. It's an example of utopia, it's an example of dystopia, the opposite of utopia. If you have questions, let's look for just a second at the response topic for this. See if we can find that. Here we go. It asks you the most obviously surreal aspect. We just talked about surrealism. The most obviously surreal aspect of The Swimmer is the element of time and how Nettie's perception of time is ultimately flawed and problematic. Explore and explain the ways that Cheever manipulates time in the story. We've talked about those. the yellow and red leaves, the signs of fall, even right down to the end when the summer constellations, he looks up in the sky and the summer constellations are gone because it's not summer anymore. But there's also his friends have moved out and left to drain their pool and have a for sale sign in front of their house. How does Cheever manipulate time in this story, and especially the signals and suggestions that time is moving in a way that is different from Nettie's sense of it? So what this story is really asking you to do is do really what I just tried to help you do. Pick out those signs and markers and signals that time is moving in a way that is different from Nettie's perception of it, where Cheever is trying to like wave at you and say, hey, look, something's wrong. The way this character's perceiving time is wrong. Pull out those markers and signals and explain them and explain what they're doing in this story. If you've got questions about that response topic, or questions about Cheever, or questions about some part of this story, or questions about how Cheever is this sort of storyteller of the suburbs when they first appear on the American landscape, of course, as always, feel free to be in touch with me. We can dig deeper into any of that. I'm happy to help you with it. Otherwise, I hope y'all enjoyed this discussion of The Swimmer by John Cheever.